organ systems. We're going to talk about the integumentary system today. When we think about the integumentary system, we are now talking about our skin, our hair, our nails. It's actually a very easy organ system when you really think about it, due to the fact that A, we all have heard of skin, we've all heard of hair, we've all heard of nails. Most people, whether they think about it or not, they have a basic idea of what our skin, hair, and nails are all about. So it's really just a matter of kind of filling in some of the blanks, maybe expanding upon some of the components of this organ system, and then adding a handful of new elements that maybe you never really thought existed before. When we think about our integumentary system ultimately takes care of covering and lining what we refer to as our body membranes. Now today, in the majority of our lecture, we're going to spend most of our time talking about our skin as we know it, on the outside of our body, but when we think about it, our integumentary system covers all of our different body surfaces, which includes the inner surfaces of our body as well, and they're classified in a couple different ways. All right, first one is we have two different categories. The first one's called our cutaneous membranes. Cutaneous membranes is what we think of when we think of our skin. So these are going to be membranes that are directly exposed to the outside world, on the outside of the body. Mucous membranes are going to be membranes that are found on the inside of the body but have exposure to the outside world. And as a result, they secrete mucus, hence the name mucous membranes. Serous membranes are membranes that are on the inside of the body that are not exposed to the outside world. And instead of secreting mucus, they secrete a fluid known as serous fluid. And we're going to have slides on each of these individually. And then last but not least, we have our synovial membranes. Synovial membranes are membranes that surround our joints. And they secrete a fluid called synovial fluid. And this synovial fluid helps to lubricate some of our major joints. When you think of your knees and your hips and elbows and shoulders, the spine, which is why it pops when chiropractors adjust you, all kinds of good fun stuff. So, we think about our epithelial membranes. These are going to be covering and lining membranes. These are epithelial tissues. Cutaneous, this is a dry membrane. It's one that is directly exposed to the outside world. This is what we're going to spend the majority of our day today talking about. The best example of this is easily the epidermis, which is composed of stratified squamous epithelium, which again is multiple layers of cells that get flat at the surface, protective in nature. And we kind of see that when we look at the outside of our skin.
Thank you.
We're going to spend all day today talking about that. The next ones are mucous membranes. These are membranes that line all of our body cavities but do have exposure to the exterior surface. So we've adapted these to be able to, these cells and tissues have adapted so that they can absorb and secrete. And primarily they're going to absorb different contents out of our digestive system and respiratory system as needed. But then they also have the ability of secreting things such as mucus, hence the name mucous membrane. So when we think about the inner lining of our digestive system is the best example of a mucous membrane. Here are going to be that simple columnar that we were looking at the other day, lining the inside of our digestive tract. This is a membrane. It is made of skin. It is part of the integumentary system in that regard. It's just not one that we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about, obviously, this membrane when we get to the digestive system. Serous membranes, these are membranes that line body cavities that do not have exposure to the outside of the body. And instead, what these do is they surround organs. Our heart is surrounded by a serous membrane. Our lungs are surrounded by a serous membrane. And these are more protective in nature in that they prevent those organs from being damaged or irritated when we breathe in and out, our heart's beating 24/7, things of that nature. So we think about linings that surround our lungs. This would be considered a serous membrane. We also have the same thing surrounding our heart. And inside this membrane is a fluid called serous fluid. And these fluids ultimately help to protect the heart or the lungs. And we'll talk about these membranes more closely when we get to the cardiovascular system, when we get to the respiratory system, because they play a much more important role, and their context is much more easily understood when we actually see them doing their job. And then last but not least, we have our synovial membranes. Synovial membranes, these are membranes that surround our joints, all the major joints of our body. Our knees, our elbows, ankles, hips, shoulders. And these are sacs that surround a joint, like we see here. And they produce a fluid, which is in the center, that ultimately separates these two bones of whatever joint this is from one another. And in doing so, they help to lubricate the joint. All of these membranes give examples of the integumentary system. But 3 of the 4 we're not really going to talk about heavily until we get to the organ system that they apply. We'll talk about this one, obviously, in the skeletal system, when the skeletal system gets to that point where we're talking about the joints. But we're going to talk specifically about synovial fluid and synovial joints, all the different things that make them unique. But for today, what we really want to talk about is the integumentary system as it applies to our hair, our skin, and our nails, as well as some of the glands that our skin ultimately produces for us, and all of their functions. If I hit you with the door, I apologize. All right, so the function of our integumentary system, we think about why we have skin, why we have hair, and why we have nails. The most important reason why we have all these things is protection. Our skin is an unbelievable protector of our body. It protects us from mechanical damage, such as bumps and cuts and running into things, chemical damages. People drop and touch stuff that's caustic all the time. If that caustic material, like bleach, for example, got into our body, we'd be in a whole host of trouble. But if it touches our skin works as a great barrier that allows that to not penetrate into the body. Thermal, our skin helps protect us from the extreme heat and extreme cold. UV light, our skin protects us from the harmful effects of the sun. And it has a protective mechanism where it allows our skin to get darker during times of increased exposure to the sun, so that the sun's UV rays can't harm us even further. Protects us from microbes. Right? Think about public restrooms, which are just kind of gross places between all the other people who are touching everything in there. But our skin does a great job of keeping any sort of microbe or bacteria, viruses, what have you, from getting into the body. And then last but not least is the idea, protects us from the idea of desiccation, which is drying out. Desiccation is if something splits or breaks because it no longer has enough fluid. And our skin does get dry all the time, but because of the way the skin is ultimately designed, it has the ability of not drying out completely through, therefore it maintains this barrier that ultimately our skin is for us. So by far, the main reason why we have an integumentary system is to protect us. Having said that, it does have some other functions. It aids in the loss and retention of body heat. Our skin does give us the ability of cooling off as we sweat, and it does give us the ability of maintaining body heat by not releasing water, by retaining water. It aids in the excretion of urea and uric acid. There are 2 types of sweat. Right? The first type of sweat, which we call perspiration, this is what helps us to maintain body temperature. But then there's a second type of body sweat, which happens in our underarms and our groin, which stinks. that ultimately is the releasing of metabolic waste, which is what urea and uric acid is. That's why we wear deodorant, that's why we wear perfumes and colognes, that's why we hopefully are taking showers on a regular basis. And then last but not least, our skin, we utilize our skin to make vitamin D. We can take the UV rays of the sun, and through some conversions, we can actually help to produce vitamin D, which our body then uses for a whole host of different things. Again, the main function of our integumentary system is a protective one, but it does have some secondary functions as well, which are equally as important. And this just kind of gives you some other ideas of the function, and all of these things over here should make more sense after we get done with the chapter and talking about all the things that happen within the skin. And so when we think about the skin, depending on the textbook that you read, the skin is made up of always made up of 2 layers, but some books have the hypodermis as a 3rd layer, other books do not. Your book in particular decided that the hypodermis is not an actual layer of the skin, but rather the 2 layers of the skin are the epidermis and the dermis. Our epidermis is the exterior most layer, or the superficial most layer of our skin. When you look down at your own hand, or your arm, or your foot, what you are looking at when you're looking at your skin is the epidermis layer of your skin. Underneath it is a connective tissue layer known as the dermis. And within the dermis, what we're going to see is a host of different things, such as all of our sweat glands, or we're going to see the hair follicles, we're going to see a muscle that's in there, we're going to see a number of different receptors that detect different types of sensations or pressures that the skin undergoes all day long. And then underneath these 2 layers, ultimately connecting the epidermis and dermis to all of our lower or deeper structures, is the layer called the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer. The hypodermis, hypo means less than, dermis, so it's below the dermis. This is the layer of our skin which anchors the skin to the underlying organs, whether it's to the skeleton, whether it's to the internal organs, whether it's to some of the connective tissues in our body. Again, your book doesn't technically consider it a part of the integumentary system, although I think that's unfair. It's basically made up of fat, and within that fat are big blood vessels, which ultimately are going to supply the blood to the epidermis and dermis one way or the other. And if we take a look at our skin as a whole, if we were to take a square chunk of our skin out, it would look something like so. Obviously, this is the surface of our body. This is the deeper structures down here. This uppermost layer, this is our epidermis. Our epidermis is made up of our epidermis is made up of stratified squamous epithelium, multiple layers of cells, the cells on the surface of which are flat. And ultimately it's referred to as keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, because in our skin, the type of cell that makes up that stratified squamous epithelium is known as a keratinocyte, and it produces a protein called keratin. Keratin ultimately helps our skin to be waterproof, and it turns our skin into a really, really good barrier to protect us from all of these exposures that the skin undergoes on a regular basis. Underneath the skin, underneath the epidermis rather, is the 2nd layer, which is this large purplish, whitish area. This is our dermis. This is primarily made up of connective tissue, a lot of collagen fibers in there because it has good strength. But ultimately, what we find in our dermis is all of the very important working parts of our skin that allow our skin to function the way that it does. Everything from sweat glands, like we see here, to oil glands, which we see here and here, our hair follicles, nerve fibers, which allow us to feel, smaller blood vessels, which supply nutrients to the dermis and ultimately supply nutrients to parts of our epidermis. There's actually a muscle in here called the erector pili muscle, which helps us to move not only our hair follicles if we need to, but also helps us to change the shape of the skin in very finite areas, give us things like goosebumps. as well as a series of receptors that ultimately help us to detect pressure and touch and things of that nature as our skin gets compressed. Underneath the dermis is that third layer. This is called the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer. This layer is primarily made up of fat, and this fat connects the skin to whatever tissue is underneath it. If this skin happens to be the skin that's on our scalp, well, that fat's connecting it to the fascia that surrounds the bones of our skull. If this skin happens to be the skin of our chest, this fat might be connecting that skin to our sternum. And within this hypodermis region, we have large blood vessels. The large blood vessels ultimately give way to the smaller blood vessels that are supplying nutrients and taking away waste materials from the dermis and the epidermis respectively. And what we're ultimately going to do is we're going to take each of these layers one by one, talk a little bit about what they're made up of and how they function, and then by doing that, we'll get the overall idea of how the skin functions as a whole. So far, so good? Good. So we talk about the epidermis. The epidermis, again, is our outer layer. It ultimately is made up of stratified squamous epithelium. The most common cell that we find within the epidermis is a cell called a keratinocyte. And a keratinocyte is a cell that produces a very important protein called keratin. And keratin, this keratin protein ultimately works, for lack of better terms, as a glue. That keratin, as it's produced by these keratinocytes, ultimately glues and binds all the cells of our epidermis to one another. And in doing so, it provides us with two very important functions. Function number one is it helps to make our skin waterproof. There's a reason why if we jump into a pool or if we soak ourselves in a bath, we don't expand like a sponge, and that's because we don't absorb water. And the reason why we don't absorb water is our skin doesn't allow us to. We don't blow up like a sponge. Two, this keratin that's produced by these keratinocytes ultimately glues these cells together, and as a result, it creates this beautiful barrier that microbes and acids and bases and things that we do not want to penetrate through our skin, they are not allowed to get their way through our skin and ultimately gain access to the inside of the body. So this keratin that's produced by these keratinocytes is the main reason why our skin functions as a great barrier. Our epidermis is avascular. What does avascular mean?
No blood circulation.
It has no direct blood supply. So our skin does not have any direct blood supply, or the epidermis doesn't, which is important because it's going to help to explain how our epidermis functions. Ultimately, if a tissue has blood supply, then that tissue has direct access to oxygen, has direct access to the removal of carbon dioxide. It has the direct access to nutrients and the ability to get rid of wastes. If a tissue is avascular, it doesn't have direct access to oxygen and nutrients. So as a result, if you don't get enough nutrients and if you don't get enough of the things that make us survive, what's going to happen to us? What happens to you if you don't get oxygen and you don't eat? You die. And what we're going to see is that our epidermis dies, right? And it dies the further it gets away from our dermis, which is very vascular. So the avascular nature will come into play. And it ultimately is composed of as many as 5 layers, which are known individually as strata. And here are the layers of our epidermis in order from deep to superficial. The deepest layer is called the stratum basal. After that is the stratum spinosum, then the stratum granulosum, the stratum lucidum, and the stratum corneum. So as we take a look at our epidermis, it looks something like so. And we're going to go over each of these layers one at a time and give you a little idea of what's happening in each of these layers. I'm going to teach it from the deepest layer to the most superficial, and then I'm going to show you the mnemonic that I use to keep them in order, because you're going to want to keep these in order from superficial to deep or deep to superficial. So what we're looking at here, just to give you an idea, if we jump back a few slides, what we're looking at right here is just this portion of the skin. Everybody with me? We're just looking at the epidermis. What we can see down here in this pinkish purplish color is the dermis. And then from this layer of cells to the surface, this is our epidermis. And our epidermis ultimately, again, has as many as 5 layers. So our first layer is this single row of cells that we see right here. This single row of cells that ultimately basically makes the transition from dermis to epidermis. This first layer of cells is known as the stratum basal. I'm just putting basal. I'm assuming that you guys are going to, everything is stratum. So the basal is our deepest layer. The stratum basal is a single layer of cells. Gesundheit. And the key function of the stratum basal is very, very simple. These are cells that are constantly, 24/7, undergoing mitosis. So this layer of cells is constantly undergoing mitosis. And as these cells are constantly producing new cells, each of the new cells that are produced move more superficially in the epidermis, therefore pushing all the cells above them further and further towards the surface. So as these keratinocytes, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 keratinocytes, and these keratinocytes are producing a new keratinocyte, and that new keratinocyte pushes up, pushing all these other keratinocytes further towards the surface, ultimately making our epidermis thicker, right? The thing about it, though, is as these cells are making our epidermis thicker, we're constantly rubbing off the cells up here, making our epidermis thinner. And usually what we're doing is we're making as many cells as we're sloughing off, so our epidermis tends to stay the same thickness all the time. Also found in this stratum basal, so constant mitosis, that's specific to the keratinocytes. So we take a look at each of these brownish, tannish cells. These are all keratinocytes. They're all producing keratin, that protein that helps to stick our cells to one another and create that barrier for us. Also found within the stratum basal, beyond there being keratinocytes that are constantly undergoing mitosis, there's 2 other cells that we find in this particular layer. The first cell, which is represented by this gray cell, is called a melanocyte. And what's the function of a melanocyte?
Produce melanin.
Produces something called melanin. What does melanin do for us? Gives us our skin color. We all have unique skin colors, which are always obviously dictated by mom and dad and grandma and grandpa before. Melanin is kind of like a box of crayons. Each of us has a different shade, all right? And a lot of it depends upon where historically we originated from. If we originated from somewhere close to the equator, such as Northern Africa, India, Northern South America, the Southern Central America, Philippines, Southern Japan, skin color tends to be what?
Darker.
Tends to be darker. And why is it darker? Because of the sun. Have you ever been to Northern Africa? It's hot as the hinges of Hades all the time. There's huge exposures to the sun. So as a result, what's happened generationally are the people who live in those neck of the woods have developed darker skin tone, because the darker your skin tone, the more protected you are from the sun. Counteract that with people who are from the Scandinavian countries, right? Now we're talking about like Norway and Finland or Iceland, Greenland. Skin colors there tend to be what? Lighter, right? Due to the fact that the exposure to the sun is A, not consistent, right? And B, when it is there, it's not as strong as it is towards the equator. So as a result, folks who are from the Scandinavian parts of the world, Northern Europe, that kind of thing, they tend to have lighter skin colors because they weren't as exposed to the sun. And then you take a look at Europe, right? Europe, you have Belgium and northern Poland and Germany and all that, where it tends to be a little bit whiter. But then you move yourself down towards the Italys and the Greeces, places like that. In Cyprus, skin color tends to get a little darker the further south in Europe you go. Take the same thing in Africa. If you go from northern Africa, but then you move yourself down to Cape Town, South Africa, what do you see a lot more of in Cape Town, South Africa? You tend to see more lighter skinned folks, because Cape Town, Africa is actually closer to Antarctica than it is to the equator, right? So it's a much more colder place than it is in northern Africa. So ultimately, the melanin that we produce, which obviously is dictated by our parents, you can look at me and you can tell that I'm obviously of European descent somewhere, right? And then there's other people in here you can see are from different descents. But ultimately, what's happened over generations is we produce a different shade of melanin. The melanin that I produce is going to be more of an orangey, yellowish melanin. There's others that are more brownish and blackish, and then there's shades in between. All that melanin is produced by these cells, which are called melanocytes. And melanocytes, as they produce their melanin, they give our skin its unique color. So the primary skin color that we have comes from melanocytes, and these melanocytes are found heavily in the stratum basal of our epidermis, producing melanin. And here's the other thing. Just think about here in Houston, I don't care what your skin color currently is, but in the summer, when it's July, end of July, and it's hot as all get out, what is happening to all of our skin tones? We're tanning, and tanning causes our skin to do what? It gets darker, right? My skin color gets darker in the summer as opposed to my skin color in the winter, which doesn't get quite as dark because we don't have the same exposure to the sun. During times of heavier exposure to the sun, these cells produce more melanin. And that production of increased melanin will increase the skin tone or the color of my skin, right? Making my skin darker, protecting me from the sun. Take other parts. Think about parts of your body that never get exposed to the sun. Like take my 9-year-old. Right? My 9-year-old's butt is 1,000 times wider than his face is. Right? Because thankfully, while my son does like to walk around the house naked and does it way too regularly, he never goes outside that way, right? That I know of. Right? So when you look at this kid's butt, you're like, damn, that's on my butt, right? But when you look at his back and his chest, because he never wears a shirt, ever wears a shirt, right? It's a much different color due to the fact that his chest and his back are constantly exposed to the sunlight because he never wears a dang shirt, right? We have a hard enough time getting them to wear pants sometimes. But even places on our own bodies have different tones, and it's all due to the different exposures to the sun. And skin that's more exposed to the sun, these cells produce more melanin, make it darker. Places that are not exposed to the sun, they produce less melanin, less tone. Fair enough? The other cell that we see also in the stratum basal is going to be this cell right here, which is purple. This is called a Merkel cell. And a Merkel cell is there to detect pressure. This is a cell we all take for granted. All of us are wearing something around our wrist, or something around a finger, or something around our waist that is ultimately compressing our body, right? Whether it's a belt, your socks as you put them on, your shoes as you tighten them. And as you were putting on your belt, you didn't have to look at the notch on your belt what you do is you do it by feel, do you not? You kind of pull it, you're like, yeah, I think that's right. And then you're like, whoa, too loose, and then you go one more, or you go one less, right? Ultimately, your skin has the ability of feeling pressure, compression. What ultimately helps you to feel that compression are these specialized sensors called Merkel cells, right? And what's great about a Merkel cell is they feel the pressure, but then after they've been exposed to that pressure for a period of time, they stop sending signals, which is why if I tell you everybody here is wearing socks, nobody was thinking about their socks and the pressure your sock is putting on your foot until I mentioned it, because your body kind of forgot about it. You forgot that you were wearing a watch, or you forgot about the jewelry that you might have on your fingers. Been wearing this thing for 22 years now, right? And so you forget that it's on half the time until something happens where I bump it into something and I hear it clang, because I just don't feel it anymore, right? Because the cells in my skin, which detect that pressure, these Merkel cells, they ultimately stop sending the signal, so you just don't feel them anymore. But they give you that initial feeling of compression of the skin. And we use this as a mechanism to not make things too tight or too loose, depending on what we're trying to do. Everybody kosher with the concept of the stratum basal, the three main cells we find within it and what they do.
I'm gonna ask you, the skin tone.
Mm-hmm.
When someone has that disease, the vitiligo,
Uh-huh.
how does that work out?
Yeah. So when you think about vitiligo, and then its worst counterpart, which is albinism, right? What's happening with vitiligo is a tough one, because that's people who on parts of their skin, these cells are no longer producing melanin, right? So these cells were either destroyed, or these cells just aren't producing melanin to the same quantity that other cells in other parts of the skin are. So what they're getting is that patchiness of white, right? And then that can come in everything from just regular vitiligo, which is what you see, like when you see like a patch of the face or the neck. You usually see it in places that are exposed to the sun pretty well, and it makes a very stark contrast. And then there's the concept of vitiligo totalis, which is when, for some reason, someone who had skin tone, right, in their youth, just lost it. And now the whole body turns white, right? So that's when, and vitiligo totalis does exist. And then there's albinism. Albinism is when these cells and the melanin they produced just never got up and going in the base case. So you're born without the ability of producing skin tone, right? So you don't have any skin tone. The eyes tend to be red because that's the natural shade of your irises. And you see it in animals all the time, like an albino rat. It's got those beady red eyes, right? Michael Jackson was thought to have vitiligo totalis. That was one of the excuses for him being Michael Jackson one way in '78 and Michael Jackson another way in '98, right? Two very different looking Michael Jacksons. One of the things that they proposed, I don't think it's true, but they proposed that he had vitiligo totalis. Personally, I think he was bleaching his skin, but because Michael Jackson, while he was talented, was a little weird. All right, next layer. So as we move up, we now move into the layer called the stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum is primarily made up of keratinocytes. So what we're looking at when we look at this spinosum layer is the vast majority of these cells are keratinocytes, and these keratinocytes, they're starting to secrete little granules. And these granules, which we see as little brown dots, they kind of give them a spiky appearance. So this layer is sometimes referred to as the spiky layer, because these cells just have this little spiky-like appearance because they're secreting these granules. And what these granules are doing is they're starting to link these cells to one another. We're actually starting to create kind of It's almost like taking 50 people and everybody just starting to hold hands. We're all linked to one another now. These cells are starting to link to one another through the releasing of these granules. And these granules, again, give these cells kind of a spiky appearance, hence spinosum. Also found within this layer is a specialized cell, which we see here in blue, and this is called a dendritic cell. And this dendritic cell gives our epidermis FX's function. Gives our skin immune function. Has anybody here ever had a skin infection? Have you ever gotten skin infections? They're terrible. Are they not? They're very, very contagious. You get like the little lumps and all that crap.
Yeah.
They're brutal.
Yeah, I stepped on like a piece of plastic outside and went up my foot, and then I was on
He said, what is that?
How you doing? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
got off work, so,
Well, yeah, you get off of work for a while, but those things are brutal. Skin infections are brutal. But thankfully, they're usually taken care of before they can ever spread. And one of the reasons is if we get exposure to something into the epidermis, these cells and their little elongated arms will find those microbes and things that'll make our skin sick and destroy them before they can ever replicate and get out of hand. Unfortunately, there's obviously examples where they don't do their job because something happens either too much or too quickly or what have you, some damage. But found within this layer are going to be these dendritic cells, which give our epidermis a little protective mechanism. The other thing that we start to see, if you look at the cells in the spinosum on the deepest end and the cells of the spinosum on the more superficial end, what are you noticing different-wise? The cells are beginning to flatten out. And why do you think these cells are beginning to flatten?
They're dying.
They are dying. Why are they dying? We want them to die. So don't say because we want them to, because while that is true, that's not the best answer. Why are these cells beginning to flatten? They're beginning to flatten because they're dying. They're not dead, but they're beginning to die. But why are they beginning to die?
You said it's good.
It's a great thing.
Getting closer to the surface.
That's true. But, well, it's going to be a protective mechanism, but that still doesn't explain why they die. What's the one thing we said about blood supply to the epidermis? Does it have it or does it not have it?
Doesn't have.
It doesn't have blood supply. So the blood supply to our skin ends right here. So as a result, how do you think these cells gain their nutrients? What cellular process, which we talked about right after we talked about organelles, do you think the skin uses, the epidermis uses to gain its nutrients and oxygen? Diffusion. It uses diffusion. So nutrients from the blood vessels in our dermis will diffuse. But diffusion is kind of like a sprinkler system, right? If you throw a sprinkler out on your front lawn, it has a circumference of only so many feet, right? And anything outside of that circumference, what happens to it? It's going to wilt and die. Does it not? Because it doesn't get enough water. Well, the circumference of diffusion is only so deep. Anything that's on the perimeter, outside the perimeter, is going to start to wilt and die. Diffusion can only go so far. So what we're seeing here are these cells are not gaining the oxygen and the nutrients that diffusion provides the deeper layers of our epidermis. So what's happening is they're starting to wilt and they're starting to die. They're not dead yet, but they're really damn close. And we want them to, right? So they're starting to flatten and wilt. And this is because they're outside of diffusion's ability to supply them with the ample amounts of oxygen and nutrients that they need to thrive. And we start to see them flatten here as they're getting towards the superficial. So the cell that was produced here and is now slowly making its way up to the surface, now it's no longer getting enough oxygen and nutrients, so it's starting to wilt. Just like a flower in your garden that doesn't get water will begin to wilt. Everybody cool with spinosum? Third layer is the stratum granulosum, which is this layer that we see right here. The stratum granulosum, these are going to be made up of flattened cells. These cells are, for all intensive purposes, gone. So these are going to be dead or virtually dead. Keratinocytes. These cells are going to be glued together by the keratin that these cells have produced. And so what we can see is all the keratin that's being produced by these little blue dots is basically linking and gluing these cells to one another. It's at this stage where we officially see a beautiful protective layer. And what's happened here is all of these cells have officially died. And the idea of these cells dying and we wanting them to die is a concept known as apoptosis. Apoptosis is literally translated to programmed cell death. Our epidermis cells are cells that are produced in order to die. We wanted them to die. And in doing so, especially since they produce all this beautiful keratin that glues them together, what we have now here is a nice strong layer of cells that are glued together, giving us a nice little barrier that prevents 99% of the things our skin is exposed to from ever being able to penetrate past it. Whether it's a microorganism, whether it's the flu bug, whether it's just disgusting things that our world is ultimately made of, it can't really get past this layer.
When you say glued by keratin,
And by glued, put glued in quotes.
Right.
It's not like it's actually squirting glue. I don't want you.
Right.
But that keratin links the cells, and it basically, while yes, this is multiple cells, it almost has this appearance of just like a mosaic of cells all stuck to one another.
okay, where did the keratin travel from?
These cells, this cell is producing keratin, this cell's producing keratin, this cell's producing keratin.
Just releasing.
They're constantly releasing keratin, but the closer they get to the surface, the more keratin they produce. And then that keratin is what ultimately is going to bind the cell together and create this beautiful protective layer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just didn't know like if the keratin was traveling.
Yeah, it's not like they produce keratin at the bottom and it all travels up with it. That's not really what's going on. They're constantly producing keratin as they move. Now, after this layer, there is a special fifth layer in certain places. This is called the stratum lucidum. This is a layer that's only found in thick skin. It's not on this current picture from your book. This is a layer of skin that's found in certain parts of the body where we refer to our skin as thick skin. If I tell you that someone has thick skin, what do we generally talk about? Or if I tell you that someone has thin skin, what am I saying about that person? If someone has thin skin, they're a little too sensitive. If someone has thick skin, they can take a joke, right? But in this, particular case, we really mean thicker skin. So, the stratum lucidum is found in areas where we have increased friction to the skin. And what are the two key areas where we have increased friction within our skin? The palms of our hands, where else? Soles of the feet. And in the epidermis of these two parts of our body, in between the stratum granulosum and the stratum corneum, there is an extra layer of skin called the stratum lucidum. It's 4 or 5 layers of dead keratinocytes that ultimately make that skin literally thicker. And all it does is provides an extra layer to those areas of the body so that as we're doing all the different tactile things that we do with our hands and all the tactile things we do with our feet, where we're sloughing off more and more cells, we got a little extra layer of cushion to make sure that that area of the skin is able to maintain its thickness. Which brings us to the last layer. This is the outermost layer. This is called the stratum corneum. This is our superficial layer. This is definitely going to be the thickest layer. Of compact dead keratinocytes. These are the cells that ultimately we slough off as we do all the different things we do with our skin. And when we slough off these dead cells, this is known as dander. So everybody here has heard of pet dander, right? Well, humans have dander too. All right? We're constantly sloughing off dead cells. And if you're allergic to cats or you're allergic to dogs, what are you ultimately allergic to?
Their hair.
No, not really.
No?
You're allergic to when their dead cells go up your nose, your body doesn't like it. That's what ultimately it is. Pet dander is, yeah, don't get me wrong, hair is in there with it. But what's really happening is as a dog scratches his skin or her skin, and all these cells go flying all over God's green earth, some of those cells go up your nose. If your body doesn't like it and creates an allergic reaction, you're now allergic to pet dander, specifically dog. Right? The cat, on the other hand, comes past you and you scratch the cat and you get some of its dead cells on your fingers, and then you touch your nose or your mouth, which we're all prone to doing, and it goes up your nose and you have a reaction, now you're allergic to cats. Pet dander is nothing more than the dead cells that an animal sloughs off of their stratum corneum, and we're doing it all day long too. But this outermost layer is what ultimately makes our skin waterproof, because there really is no binding. I mean, there's no way that anything can penetrate water-wise through this layer. And it helps to cement, if you will, our skin being a protective barrier. So again, in the next few slides, we talk about each of these different, I talk about each of these different layers. Here's the different layers all on slides for you. But the one thing you're going to have is some sort of mnemonic, because the one thing they love to ask, I know we talked about, I think we talked about the HESI test with somebody in here. It was either this class or my 10 o'clock class. But one question they ask sometimes is about the layers of the skin. We're certainly going to ask it in class. You need to have some way of memorizing the layers in order. So, I'm a big fan of mnemonics, and if these are the 5 layers of the epidermis from superficial to deep, I had a mnemonic years ago, and to the life of me, I can't remember what it was, because a female student one time came up to me and she goes, I came up with the perfect mnemonic for the layers of the skin. I'm like, all right, hit me with it. And then she did, and I'm like, all right, well, that's my new mnemonic. What she told me she remembered was cute, Latino, guy, sexy, butt. And I'm like, boom, I will never forget that mnemonic as long as I live. So, cute Latino guy, sexy butt is a good mnemonic for remembering the layers of the epidermis from superficial to deep. Knowing that lucidum only occurs in thick skin. So sometimes you have to go with cute guy, sexy butt. And of course, if you want to make that Latvian or any other nationality, it's up to you. But I find the best mnemonics are always tinged a little bit with something a little blue. And if you're offended by this one, you're going to hate the ones I give you later on down the road. Yes,
So
ma'am?
my other teacher, Carol, likes to get some bread.
Which one are you going to remember better?
Carol.
Really?
Yeah.
The bread one?
Yeah.
Oh, my brain doesn't work that way. I'll be the first to tell you, my brain works definitely more along the lines of this one. The key, I don't care what mnemonic you use. All right, use any mnemonic. This is the one that I use to keep it straight in my head at this point. I find the best mnemonics always are tinged a little bit, either in sex or what have you. And we're all adults. Everybody good with the epidermis? So when we think about, again, some of those extraneous structures, melanin, this is the pigment that's produced by melanocytes. This is ultimately what gives us our skin's unique colors. The color of melanin can be anything from yellow to brown to black. Your color of melanin, the shade of melanin your skin produces, is obviously dictated by mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and great-grandma and great-grandpa before them. Ultimately, that gets handed down via genetics. But ultimately, when we think about what shade of melanin you produce, it really goes back to 2 key things. How much sunlight you're currently exposed to, where your nationality ultimately originated from, which is ultimately what gave your ancestors their skin color, and then the genetics that they pass down to you as different colored folks produce children with other different colored folks. Does that make sense? The dendritic cells that we see, these are ultimately going to be immune in nature. Their job is to help to prevent viral and bacterial infections as they try to penetrate through the skin, and 99% of the time they do their job just fine. Merkel cells, these are ultimately touch receptors that ultimately give us the ability to understand different touches that happen to the skin, specifically different pressures as we put on a watch or a belt or socks. We can feel them, and then they quickly turn off because they realize that that pressure that they're ultimately being set off by isn't a dangerous thing to the body. Which brings us to our dermis. When we think about our dermis, and now what we're looking at is this portion of the skin. Our dermis is made up of 2 key layers. The uppermost layer, this is called the papillary layer, and the papillary layer is ultimately the part of the dermis that attaches to the epidermis. And it creates these little mountains, if you will, that kind of bulge into the epidermis. And these little ridges are known as dermal papilla. And what's cool about dermal papilla is 2 things. One, the dermal papilla helps the epidermis and the dermis to adhere to one another. But these dermal papilla, these little bumps, actually create a bump in the skin surface, which we call a what?
Whitehead.
Those are all bad things. This is a normal anatomy.
The hair bone? Hair bone? Fingerprint?
Fingerprint. We call them a fingerprint. What is a fingerprint? It's just a ridge on the surface of our skin, correct? The ridges that are on the surface of our skin are made up by these little dermal papilla pushing on the underbelly of the epidermis, giving us a very unique pattern of ridges on our skin that's unique to each individual, because every dermal papilla is just kind of randomly there, which is why everybody's fingerprints are so different. Now, beyond being able to be caught should you commit a crime, what's the real reason why we as human beings have fingerprints and these little ridges on our skin? For grip. It gives our skin a better ability to kind of grip things as we're doing all these different tactile sensations. So as we look at the dermis, the outermost layer is the papillary layer. It contains little projections called dermal papilla, and these dermal papilla ultimately push up on the underbelly of our epidermis, which gives our surface of our hands and feet in particular a very unique ridge that we refer to as a fingerprint. But the fingerprint that we think of from a standpoint, again, of getting caught by the police if you commit a crime, the real reason why we have them is it gives our skin friction that gives us a greater ability to grip. Does that make sense? The bottom layer and the majority of our dermis is referred to as the reticular layer. And within the reticular layer, this is where all the cool things of our skin are located. Blood vessels, sweat and oil glands, receptors of all kinds that help us to detect deeper pressures. And so when we think about, why is skin color there? When we think about all the cool things of the skin, they're all found in the dermis. For some reason I put skin color here. So before we jump into the rest of the dermis, let's talk about, there are three things that give us unique skin color. When we think about why we have the different skin colors we have, the main reason why you have skin color is because of our melanin. Melanin is the key ingredient. So whatever your normal skin color is, melanin is the reason. Keratin and hemoglobin are unique, different ways that we can gain other skin colors. When we think about hemoglobin, now we're talking about the red of our blood vessels. What's a good example of people being red, having a red skin color due to blood supply? We've all experienced it.
Blushing?
Blushing, yeah, blushing's a good one. Embarrassment, right? Something happens, you get embarrassed, and next thing you know, your cheeks get flushed with red, right? That's the blood vessels getting a little closer to the skin color, the skin surface, and gives you a red hue. You ever hear about women having the glow of pregnancy?
Yeah.
Right, which I think is garbage. I've been with my wife 4 times. She was never glowing with pregnancy. All right? She glows, but that wasn't one of the times. But ultimately, that glow of pregnancy, as women get pregnant and their hormones start to increase and they start to get a little more blood supply, a lot of people say, well, your cheeks change their color. And so as a result, you can kind of tell they're pregnant even when they don't even know. I'm like, that's not true. The fact that she was throwing up 34 to 40 times a day, that's how I knew something's wrong with this one. We got something going on. All right? The last one is keratin. Keratin, with some vegetables and some of the raw fishes of the world, has a lot of keratin in it, and that ultimately gives us a yellow, orangey appearance. In fact, there's a lot of studies that suggest that the Asian populations of the world, who kind of have their own very unique tone, whether it's from the Philippines all the way up to the Koreas, they have a diet that's much more heavily, has a lot more vegetables and raw fish in it, which comes with it increased amounts of keratin. There's a lot of suggestion that that unique skin color is because of the keratin mixing with their melanin. So these are just different ways we can have skin colors. There are some bad skin colors, all right? Redness, i.e., we've all had a redness from inflammation and hypertension, fever, allergy, where now your skin just turns red. Pallor is blanching. That's when your skin becomes whiter or paler than it usually would be. This is usually due to emotional stress or anemia, low blood pressure, or low blood flow to the area of the skin. Jaundice, which is never good. Jaundice turns your skin yellow. My very first patient, the first patient I ever treated ever, When he walked into the room, he was as yellow as a banana, from his tip of his head to the tip of his toes, the whites of his eyes, the inside of his gums. Everything was yellow. And it turned out that he had jaundice, and Ray Charles could have seen it. But it turned out he had pancreatic cancer, and he died, I don't know, a year later. Right? That was what he ultimately was diagnosed with, and he died from it. Typically, it shows a liver disorder, but in his case, it wasn't his liver, it was his pancreas. And then obviously black and blue, which is broken blood vessels, which we refer to as a bruise. These are all different varieties of skin color your book talks about. So let's get to the good stuff. So the components of the dermis. We have our oil glands, our sweat glands, we have hair, and we have nails. These are all the key appendages of our dermis. So as we're taking a look at this same skin model from before, we've talked about the epidermis and its 5 layers. We've talked about the papillary layer with its dermal papilla giving us our unique fingerprints. Now we're talking about everything that's found in the rest of the dermis, which really boils down to a few components. We have sweat glands, we have oil glands, hair follicles, and the muscles associated with them. And then we have nails, which ultimately are produced from this portion of the skin as well. So, sebaceous oil glands first. We talk about sebaceous oil glands. These are oil glands that are located all over the skin, palms of the hands, soles of the feet, and they produce something called sebum. And sebum is an oil. And this oil actually does some good things for us. One, it keeps our skin nice and soft and moist. We don't think of our skin as being moist per se, but you'll know when your skin isn't moist and it gets dry. What's the one thing that happens to a lot of people during the winter time to their skin?
Crack.
They get ashy, right? They get ashy, which means their skin dries out and then their skin starts to flake, right? And for most of us, we're like, why in the heck am I so itchy, right? And it's just because you need to lotion up a little bit, right? A little lotion goes a long way, right? But we have oil that prevents our skin from drying out and becoming ashy. Furthermore, this moisture helps to keep our skin more pliable so that as we try to do all the different things with our skin, it's more receptive to it. Second thing these oil glands do is they prevent our hair from becoming brittle. What is one thing hair-wise I'm never going to ever have to worry about as long as I live, that women with long hair worry about all the time?
Split ends.
Split ends. I've never had a split end. I will never have a split end, ever, because my hair doesn't ever get long enough. But the thing that this oil does is it lubricates and moisturizes our hair follicles. And so as our hair comes out of our scalps, or our skin for that matter, it has this nice little oil on the outside of it which nourishes the hair and prevents it from splitting. But the longer the hair grows, the more likely that oil is not going to quite get to the end, and the tips of the hair dry out, and as they dry out, they split. We call that a split end. And then last but not least, this sebum prevents bacteria that land on our skin from being able to penetrate into the skin. It helps to kill bacteria. And when we're taking a look at these oil glands, we're looking at them right here. These are our sebaceous oil glands. They surround our hair follicles, and as the hair is being produced and getting out, leaving the skin, these oil glands will put oil onto this hair follicle, nourishing the hair itself, but then these little shafts that ultimately allow the hair to exit the skin, the oil will exit the skin with it, and then nourish a portion of our skin. And since our hair is located all over our body, the skin gets nourished as well with this oil, which again nourishes the skin, prevents it from cracking and breaking and becoming ashy and dry. It's a protective mechanism. And on top of that, it helps to kill bacteria. It's a win-win-win. Everybody kosher with those. The second thing that we find in our dermis is our sweat glands. And sweat glands form two varieties. There's two varieties of sweat glands. And the difference between these two sweat glands is twofold. One, their function. Yes, they both produce sweat, but that sweat is very, very different, one gland to the other, and two, their location. The first one are called eccrine sweat glands. And an eccrine sweat gland is a sweat gland that is found everywhere. You name a part of your body, you have eccrine sweat glands. And the job of the eccrine sweat gland is to produce an acidic sweat that is primarily made up of water, salts, a little bit of vitamins, and maybe some trace amounts of metabolic waste, but very little. And the main function of these sweat glands, these eccrine sweat glands, is to lower our body temperature. If you're out in the sun and you start to sweat and you perspire on your forehead, this is eccrine sweat glands at work. And if you take that sweat off of your forehead and were to smell it, does it smell like body odor? No. And if you were to taste it, what does it taste like?
Ew.
Oh, stop it. You've all tasted your sweat. Everybody here, you can give me the look all you want. You're either lying to me or you're lying to yourself. Everybody here has tasted sweat.
I just met you.
Otherwise, either that or you
your
haven't
head.
sweat hard enough, in which case, get up and do something for a living, all right? You can't tell me you haven't sweat and some of it dripped into your mouth, all right? What does that sweat taste like? It's salty, right? It doesn't smell like body odor, it's not gross, it's just salty water, right? And what this ultimately is water being released from your body in order to help you regulate your body temperature. If it does smell, it's because your skin's dirty, in which case take more showers and you can eliminate that problem. You had a question though. Someone had a question. And I kind of ramroded it.
I just meant I don't wipe and then like taste.
I'm not saying people do this, but you can't tell me you're not playing baseball or basketball or outside doing something and it doesn't like drip down into your mouth a little bit. You've all tasted sweat. Knock it off. Bunch of liars. I'm liberties. Right. Apocrine sweat glands. These are the other types of sweat glands. Apocrine sweat glands. These are sweat glands that are primarily found in two very key places. One is in your underarm, the other is in your groin area. And the sweat that's produced from this part, from these glands, is primarily metabolic waste. And so we're releasing this metabolic waste that ultimately contains within it a lot of little fatty acids. And when these fatty acids hit oxygen, they stink. And they give us what we refer to as body odor. Do these particular sweat glands help with body temperature? Yeah, a little bit. But that's not their main function. The main function is to get rid of metabolic wastes. And the problem is, again, when exposed to the oxygen in the atmosphere, they stink. They start to ferment, and that fermentation smells bad, which is why we wear deodorants and take showers.
Is there a reason why they are where they are, like location-wise?
That's a great question. Why do we put them in the underarms and the groin?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I would assume there has to be a rationale of why the body did that, but for the life of me, I do not know that answer.
There's no airflow.
Oh, there's airflow, but
Yeah.
it's definitely a little, it's more restricted than other parts of, but thank God they're there.
Right.
Because can you imagine if it was, can you imagine if it was like on our face? We'd constantly smell like BO. It'd be terrible. Yes, ma'am.
So, I'm never deodorant really because she doesn't smell it.
Who doesn't wear deodorant?
My mom, but she doesn't have like, she doesn't have an odor. She's never had an odor since she was a kid. Is there a reason for that?
Your mom doesn't wear any deodorant? She's just au naturel all the time.
Yeah, but she doesn't smell either, right?
How European of her. I like it.
I mean, is there a reason?
Good for her. I guarantee you part of it's genetics, part of it's dietary, for sure. And there is a portion of it that she's probably putting something there. You know, whether it's soap from the shower, she's doing something.
Me, I just shower.
Either that or she's never doing anything physically active, which I find hard to believe.
And Ash is like, no.
Yeah, so that's an unusual one. Not wearing any deodorant and not smelling a little bit. You know, you usually can find out within 10 feet if someone put some deodorant on that morning. I mean, we've all been around folks who didn't deodorize, right? Like, dude, chief, you need to put something on.
Could the odor of like those specific areas could be from what you eat?
Oh, absolutely. How you smell in your diet is definitely going to be you know, if you have a very rich protein diet with a lot of, you know, the better your diet, in theory, the better the smell. The more carbs you put into it, the more fats you put into it, the thicker that sebum, that sweat's gonna be, and the thicker it is, the more yellow it is, the more fat that's in it, the more it's gonna smell. So yeah, your diet will dictate it to some extent. But, you know, at the end of the day, it is what it is. We all start to secrete this throughout the day in our groin area through these very specific sweat glands called apocrine sweat glands. And as we look back at this model, these are the sweat glands we're talking about. They have their own little duct to the surface of the skin. Which one we're talking about is dictated by the part of the body this skin belongs to. If this belongs to the underarm, if this skin belongs to the groin area, this sweat gland is an apocrine sweat gland. On the same token, this block of skin is coming from the forearm or your thigh or your leg or your foot. That sweat gland is an eccrine sweat gland. Its primary function is going to be to reduce body temperature when our body starts to overheat.
I know it's a strange question, but does deodorant, like, is it, I know it masks the smell, but you know how it's like releasing waste? And then deodorant kind of like repels it? Does it like keep it there? Is it
Well,
bad?
there's two types of deodorant. Deodorant type number one is one that just gives you a smell. And so what you're basically doing is trying to mask the color. And then there's an antiperspirant. Right? The antiperspirant does give you that smell as well because it always has a unique scent to it. But then it also has within it chemicals that help to limit the amount of metabolic waste that part of the skin releases. And which one you want to use, that's up to you. You know, I know that there's one brand that works for me, tried and true, 24/7, 12 months a year. And if I use that one brand, I never feel any problems. But if I use other brands, there's times I'm like, dude, this didn't even work there. So
What is this?
I'm a degree guy.
Oh, degree.
So I know, okay, like.
And it's gotta be the white one, not the gel. Has to be that white crap, right? Because I use the gel, the next thing you know, like my armpits become inflamed. What the hell? My skin doesn't like that stuff.
So if that's waste, I know like there's I know some people who sweat excessively, they use filler, like in their armpit.
Yeah.
So they don't sweat, so is that like bad?
What is that?
In my opinion, no. Like if you're one of those folks who excessively sweats, that's gotta be tough.
Well, I've just seen a like a
You know what I mean?
video about it.
No, but there are people that have like excessive sweat issues, right? And so that's where like the Michelins and there's some of these high dollar deodorants that really do a good job of combating that by significantly decreasing how much they ultimately. There's some people, there's a buddy of mine who has to carry deodorant wherever he goes, right? Especially in the summer times, because dude has to reapply a couple times a day. And I feel for the guy, because he's a principal.
Oh,
Right?
no.
He's the principal of an elementary school, right? So he's constantly with the public, right? And he's a great guy, but dude, I don't know if he's got a nervous tick. I don't know if it's just the way mama or dad put genetics. I don't know what the hell happened, but dude sweats a bunch,
He just
right?
needs to move up north.
Oh, that's one thing, I guess. But I don't think it would make that big of a difference. I don't, because it's not his body, he's inside a school. Do you know how cold they keep elementary schools right now?
Yeah.
They're like 65 degrees. My wife's wearing a jacket in the summertime inside her school, right? So, you know, but for him, he uses one of these top dollar, like prescription type of deodorants, and as long as he applies like 3 times a day, 4 times a day, he stays golden, right? But in his little office at his school, he's got a little cabinet, and that's where his deodorant is. So wherever he goes, he's hooked up, right? Everyone's a little different. So for those people who are excessive sweaters, I would tell them, hey, look, find something that helps to limit how much sweat you put out. For those who, you know, for everybody else, you got to pick your poison. It's your body. You do you, and I'll do me.
Okay, so when people, I didn't know people got Botox in their armpits. That is very.
People get Botox everywhere
Wait,
nowadays.
I see, but like, where does the metabolic waste just go somewhere else to be released?
Botox doesn't really. I can't imagine Botox really does anything to limit sweating.
It does. It stops you.
I have a hard time with that one. I don't understand how botulinum prevents sweating. But I see Botox being used with so many different things these days. I think it's crazy to inject Botox into your armpit.
That's how you do it.
Ultimately, it's not gonna get, if it does stop it, the skin's retaining it, which in and of itself is not a good thing.
Right, okay.
That's like saying, let me do something to prevent me from peeing as much.
Mm,
That's ultimately what you're kind of saying to your skin. I get it,
yeah.
you don't want to sweat and smell horrible. I get that concept, all right? But on the same token, to limit it, now, don't get me wrong, I would like to think that your groin would then take over and probably secrete more,
So you'd
but
stink.
doesn't that create the same problem,
Yes.
right?
You can't
Just
just-
instead of it coming from here, it's coming from here.
Ooh.
Right? Either way, so my feeling is instead of spending $150 on Botox injections in your underarm, find something that controls it and covers it like everybody else. Everybody here, if you didn't wear deodorant today, you would stink by mid-morning.
Yeah.
Right? We're all the same, and we gotta stop being so freaking, weird. About that stuff. All right. Believe it or not, we're kind of done. We're at the point. What we're gonna do is we're gonna take this. We have to still finish 4 tissues in lab. We're gonna do those first. We're gonna take the quiz first. Then we have 4 tissues, and then we'll ultimately finish this up on